Hello, welcome to the next lesson. Today we're going to continue talking about logical fallacies. And the next fallacy we're going to look at is called the ad hominem fallacy. And it's a common fallacy that you can see people make on TV or just in the real world as well. And this occurs when a person is attacked rather than the view the person asserts. Even though there may be something wrong with a person's character, this does not necessarily mean that this person's argument is wrong. So what's going on with this fallacy is that someone presents an argument, and then another person who would like to object to this argument attacks this person's character rather than the argument itself. And then this person says, well, therefore the argument is wrong. However, that is itself a logical fallacy. For example, it could be the case that there's a criminal, let's say, who is a murderer, and he's in jail. And now he's being interviewed. And in his interview in jail, the interviewer asks him, is murdering wrong? And this interviewer says, this person being interviewed says, you know, I've had a long time to think about it, and I finally come to the conclusion that murdering is wrong, and that what I did is wrong. Well, is it the case that what came out of this person's mouth is false because this person himself is a murderer? No, what came out of their mouth is in fact actually true, that murdering is wrong. So if someone were to attack this person's character and say, look, we cannot trust this person and what they say because they are a murderer, that means it would be false that murdering is wrong. But actually what came out of this person's mouth is correct. So here we can see that just because you attack someone's character, it doesn't follow that that what they say is therefore wrong. To look at this argument or this fallacy in a more formal way, what's going on when someone commits this fallacy is this. Here's the first premise. H asserts statement S. So we have some person H who makes a statement S. The second premise, there is something objectionable about H, about the person, him or herself. Conclusion, therefore, statement S is false. If we notice here, just looking at this fallacy formally, what can you see is wrong with this argument, just looking at it in standard form? Well, in the premises, the objection is against H. So in the premises where you provide reasons and evidence in favor of the conclusion, we see that the objection is against H, not against the statement S. Therefore, one is not justified to object to S in the conclusion. You cannot reach a conclusion that is against statement S unless there's something against statement S in your premises. But there is nothing against statement S in the premises. Therefore, there is a problem with this argument. Now, if the conclusion happened to be against H, against the person, saying, for example, therefore this person is unreliable, or this person is a bad person, well then that itself would be justified, right? Assuming that the premises are against that particular aspect of this person's character. So if the conclusion is against H rather than S, then the premises may be relevant. But just in and of themselves, an attack on a person's character doesn't necessarily mean anything that their statement, such as murder is wrong, is therefore false, based on an attack on this person's character. Okay, so the next fallacy is, we can actually think of it as a subset of the ad hominem fallacy. It's a type of ad hominem fallacy, and this is fallacy of guilt by association. And this fallacy is committed when people are attacked based on their association with a person, group, or view that's considered objectionable. So notice here what's going on is the same general thing that's going on with an ad hominem fallacy. A person's membership in a group here is being attacked, and therefore they're saying this person's claim or statement is therefore false. Nothing is said at all about whether or not the statement itself is false. But the only thing that's in the premises is that their membership in a particular group is problematic in some kind of way. Nothing in the premises is against statement S. For example, it could be the case that maybe a student says, here's an idea from another student, and this first student immediately dismisses this second student's idea because they say, oh, well, this person is a member of this fraternity group or this particular sorority. So therefore, what they said about university policy for students is therefore wrong because they're a member of this group that I don't like. Right? That in and of itself does not say anything about what came out of their mouth as far as university policy for students. So what came out of their mouth could in fact actually be correct. And you need to attack the actual details of what came out of their mouth rather than attacking their membership in a particular group. Another example is maybe in politics, for example, someone might give an idea about maybe a new kind of program that the government should run, and this person's idea might be attacked merely because they're a member of a particular party that's looked upon as being negative in some way. They might say, oh, well, this guy's a member of their party, so we shouldn't even listen to their particular idea. Their particular idea is wrong. Well, that doesn't follow, right? You actually have to look at the details of this politician's program and criticize the ins and outs and the fine-grained detail of their policy or program, not merely just attacking them merely based on the fact that they're part of this particular party is itself not sufficient. Perhaps their idea is a good one. The next fallacy is an appeal to ignorance. And this is when one claims that a statement is true because it has not been shown to be false. So someone might say, well, it hasn't been shown to be false yet, so therefore I think it's true. In essence, formally, how it looks like when someone commits this fallacy is this. You have the first premise: it has not been shown that statement S is false. Conclusion, therefore, statement S is true. To show you why this is a fallacy, someone might say this: well, no one has shown me that it's false that invisible fairies exist. It hasn't been falsified yet. And invisible fairies, you cannot test for whether they exist or not because they're invisible. We can't see them. So since that hasn't been shown to be false yet, that fairies exist, therefore it's true that invisible fairies exist. This is a bad argument, right? This shows you why making this kind of move is a bad one. In order to show that some statement S is true, you need positive confirming evidence that statement S is true in order to justify it. So if I want to try to conclude that invisible fairies do exist, I need some kind of positive confirming evidence that fairies are that these kinds of fairies exist. I cannot try to sufficiently justify my conclusion that invisible fairies exist merely based by saying, well, it hasn't been shown to be false yet that invisible fairies exist, so therefore invisible fairies exist. Right? That kind of move does not work, and that is to commit a fallacy, namely the appeal to ignorance. Next, begging the question fallacy. This is when a premise of an argument asserts the conclusion of the argument. So in other words, the conclusion is contained somewhere in the premises. And you cannot assume that the conclusion is true in your premises in order to prove that the conclusion is true. So remember, your premises are there in order to try and prove that the conclusion is true. Well, in your premises, when you're trying to prove that your conclusion is true, you cannot somehow assume that your conclusion is already true in your premises. So whether the conclusion is true or not, that is the question. So when there's an argument, right, and there's some kind of debate, let's say, or some kind of issue at hand where people are trying to figure out what the conclusion is, well, someone might propose a conclusion on the particular matter, and whether or not that conclusion is true or not, that is the question at hand. To assume that the conclusion is already true in your premises in order to argue that the conclusion is true, that is to beg the very question. So that's why this fallacy is called begging the question, because the question at hand is whether or not someone's proposed conclusion is true. That's the question. Well, you're not really answering the question. You're only begging the question if, in trying to prove that your conclusion is true, you've already assumed that your conclusion is true in your supposed proof of it. You're not really answering the question because you've already assumed an answer to the question in your proof. So, as an exercise here, can you see how this following argument begs the question? This is kind of a classic argument that's given to show you of a particular argument that begs the question. The first premise of this argument is this: God wrote the Bible. The second premise is that everything said in the Bible is true. And the third premise is that, well, the Bible asserts that God exists. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. So notice the question at hand is whether or not God exists. In this particular argument, this argument is trying to say that God does exist. So the question is whether God exists or not. And there is the fallacy of begging the question contained within this argument. Can you see where the fallacy actually occurs, where they're begging the very question about whether God exists or not by assuming that God exists somewhere in the present premises? So where this is begging the question is in the first premise. The first premise says God wrote the Bible. And this first premise doesn't explicitly say the words in the conclusion, namely God exists, but it is implicitly contained within the first premise, because the first premise implicitly assumes that God already exists. Right? The first premise can be read as really saying something like this: God exists and wrote the Bible. Well, since God exists and wrote the Bible, second premise, everything said in the Bible is true. Why is everything said in the Bible true? It's because God exists and God wrote the Bible. Well, if everything said in the Bible is true, the Bible asserts that God exists. Therefore, God exists. However, that conclusion is implicitly contained within the first premise. Therefore, this argument is a bad one. So continuing talking about this fallacy, people who beg the question usually insert additional premises in order to hide the fact that they are begging the question. Sometimes when people commit this fallacy, they are not aware that they themselves are committing a logical fallacy. And they might only come to realize it when someone points out that they've committed this fallacy. But other times, people know that they're begging the question, and they're trying to be sneaky about it. Perhaps a good number of lawyers and politicians, for example, may try to make this move. And in order to hide the fact that they're committing this fallacy, they'll insert many premises into their argument, so that there's many things that your mind has to keep track of in their particular argument, such that since your mind is so busy keeping track of all these various premises, many people will not be able to see that this person is begging the question. So they try to hide the fact that they're begging the question by inserting additional premises. Now, in common language and usage, the term, when you hear people, let's say on TV or in the real world, say that this begs the question or begging the question, at many times they're using this phrase to mean something else. They're not saying that there is some kind of logical fallacy occurring here. So don't get confused when you hear this at many times, let's say on TV. This phrase, begging the question, at many times is used to mean that there's a question that naturally comes to mind. They might be saying, well, we've been talking about this one particular issue, and there's a related issue that maybe we should talk about. So to give you an example, there might be some kind of fashion TV show on, and they're talking about the summer fashion for women, let's say. And they've been having this conversation on TV about the summer fashion for women, and then as a host might say, well, this begs the question, what's the summer fashion for men's clothing? They're not saying here that there's some kind of logical fallacy someone's making. They're just saying, look, we've been talking about summer fashion for women, and there's this kind of related issue about men's summer fashion that naturally comes to mind given our previous discussion of summer fashion for women. That's usually what begging the question means. In more technical at more technical times, when they say begging the question, it actually can mean that they're using a logical fallacy, or they're trying to point out logical fallacy. For example, if you're watching a political debate, that when they say begging the question, in that kind of context, they really could be meaning that you've committed a logical fallacy and that your argument is wrong. Okay, so now here are some problems here where it's up for you to decide what fallacy is at hand. And it could be the case that there's a fallacy being committed from, and it could be a fallacy from the previous lecture as well. So that's also open game here. So let's look at the first question or issue. I think that the oysters made me sick. After all, no one has shown me that they didn't make me sick. What fallacy is at hand here? Well, the fallacy at hand here is that this is the appeal to ignorance. They're saying it's false, or that they didn't make me sick, so therefore it's true that the oysters made me sick. Right? No one has shown that it's false, that the oysters made me sick, so therefore it's true that the oysters made me sick. And this is a fallacy, right? You have to actually have positive confirming evidence that the oysters are the culprit here that made you sick. For example, based on this argument, let's say you were eating a seafood dish that had oysters and shrimp on it. It could be the case that the shrimp made you sick, right, in this particular case. You actually need positive confirming evidence showing that it was the oysters that made you sick rather than the shrimp. Okay, so let's look at the second one. Every morning for the past 10 years, I've had raisin bran for breakfast. I must keep having it. So this commits the fallacy of appeal to tradition. This is saying, well, I've done something for 10 years. It's kind of a tradition here of eating raisin bran for breakfast. Therefore, I must keep doing it. Number 3, if you don't start believing in this mission, you'll spend the next 10 years in the brig. What fallacy is here? Well, the fallacy at play here is an appeal to fear. The person saying this is trying to sway you by the use of an emotion of fear. Well, you're going to spend the next 10 years in the brig unless you start believing in this mission. There's no move here to use some kind of logical reasoning for whether or not you should start believing in this mission, such as, for example, that this mission will help save lives in your country or something like that. There's no attempt here at some kind of logical rationale for why you should start believing in the mission, but rather there's an appeal to fear and emotion to try to sway you. Number 4, my opponent has committed adultery. He cheated on his taxes. He hired an illegal alien as a nanny. His views on tax reform simply can't be trusted. What fallacy is at play here? The fallacy at work here is the ad hominem fallacy. There's an attack on this person's character, and then this attack on this person's character, the conclusion drawn from that, or attempted to be drawn from that, is that we shouldn't listen to this person's tax reform policy. Notice there's nothing in the premises that actually looks into the details of the tax reform policy and criticizes it as being wrong. So therefore, you would not be warranted in drawing a conclusion that the tax reform policy simply cannot be trusted. Number 5, thoughts are non-physical entities, so they're not in the physical world. What kind of fallacy is at play here? The fallacy at hand here is that it's begging the question. We look at the conclusion that thoughts are not in the physical world. Right? We have the indicator word there, so. And what follows after so is the conclusion. Thoughts are not in the physical world. What's the premise given for it in this argument? Well, the premise is that thoughts are non-physical entities. That's another way of saying the conclusion that thoughts are not in the physical world. Right? It's just a different way of saying the same thing, that is the conclusion. So, in other words, the conclusion is contained within the premises. Sometimes you can have people commit this fallacy where it's a little bit more clear and maybe a little easier to see that they're begging the question, such as in number 5. And you can have ones that are more sneakier, such as in our previous example, in regards to the existence of God, that particular argument, where that's a little bit harder to determine that they're begging the question. Okay, so that's it for today, and I will see you in the next lesson.